All right, so today we're really diving into this whole economic tug of war that's going on around the war in Ukraine.
Hmm.
We hear about the sanctions and everything, but like, what's the real impact? What's the economic reality on the ground over there in Russia? That's what we're looking at today. And we're going to be using a visual politic analysis to help us unpack that.
Okay.
And, they're known for like their really in-depth, data-driven geopolitical stuff. So I think this will be a good one to unpack.
Yeah, their stuff is always interesting. I'm curious to see what they have to say. It's interesting how we kind of fixate on the immediate military stuff, right? Like troop movements and all this new weaponry. But a lot of times it's these underlying economic realities, this long game that really determines how things play out.
Totally. It's like that heavyweight boxing match, where everyone's watching for the knockout punch, but really it's like the stamina, it's the strategy, round after round that wins the fight.
Exactly. And visual politic, they actually use this really interesting phrase to describe Putin's strategy. They call it the Esparta strategy. Basically, they're arguing that he's deliberately trying to reshape Russia into a modern-day Sparta.
Whoa, okay, hold on, Sparta. Like the ancient Greek warriors. Is Putin like seriously trying to turn back the clock 2,000 years? I mean, come on.
Well, not literally, of course, but I think what they're getting at is the mindset, right? Like, visual politics suggests that Putin sees military might as the ultimate source of power and legitimacy, much like those Spartans of old.
So he's like going all in on this kind of like neo-Spartan revival.
Mm.
But I mean, can a nation really thrive in the 21st century, by channeling these ancient military ideals? I don't know. It just seems like a recipe for trouble.
Yeah, it's a big gamble for sure. And that's something visual politic definitely doesn't shy away from. They highlight the potential pitfalls of this approach. One of the most concerning is the impact on everyday Russians, because this relentless focus on militarization, it comes at a steep cost. And I mean, that literally.
Well, yeah, right. I mean, all those resources being funneled into the military-industrial complex, that means less money for basically everything else,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And we're not even just talking about putting off infrastructure projects or delaying a new school here and there. I mean, Visual Politic points out that essential services like healthcare education, they're being stretched incredibly thin.
Mm.
Funding drying up qualified professionals becoming scarce.
Yeah, I bet that's got to be creating a ton of anxiety and hardship for just like normal families.
Oh, absolutely. It's a really tough situation.
Yeah.
And it gets even kind of more unsettling. Visual Politics cites instances of factories literally recruiting teenagers, like 14 and 15-year-olds, to keep these production lines running. That's how bad the labor shortage is becoming.
Whoa, hold up. 14-year-olds working in factories? Are you serious? Are there even like any safeguards in place to protect these kids?
That's unclear. What is clear is that this economy of war, as visual politic terms, it is really pushing Russia further and further away from any kind of sustainable economic model. It's like they're laser focused on building tanks, but they're neglecting the foundations of their society.
So instead of investing in education technology, things that will prepare them for the future, they're literally throwing teenagers into factories to build weapons.
Yeah, in a nutshell. And that short-sighted approach, it even extends to their technology too. Visual Politic highlights Russia's heavy reliance on a lot of outdated equipment, inefficient production methods. It's a stark contrast to the West's more technologically advanced military industry.
Okay, so we've got a country trying to sustain a 21st century war with this like Frankenstein economy cobbled together for like ancient Spartan ideals and outdated technology. It sounds like a recipe for disaster. The question is, how long can they actually keep this balancing act going?
Right, that's the million-dollar question. And this is where visual politic brings in, I think, a really crucial piece of the puzzle. It's something that's often overlooked in a lot of the mainstream coverage of this, and that's the sanctions.
Right, the economic sanctions imposed by the West and its allies. I mean, we hear about them, but are they actually having like a real tangible impact, or are they more symbolic?
Well, Visual Politic argues that while the sanctions may not have caused like this immediate collapse of the Russian economy, which is what some people were predicting, they're having a really profound and debilitating effect. It's like this slow-acting poison. Oh, wow. So it's like death by 1,000 cuts rather than one fatal blow.
Precisely. And remember that national wealth fund we were talking about, the one that's being raided to prop up this war effort. Well, according to Visual Politic, it's hemorrhaged value since the war began shrinking by a staggering 50%.
50%. That's like if you woke up tomorrow and found out your retirement fund had been cut in half. That's got to be sending shockwaves through the Russian government.
Absolutely. And to make matters even worse, the sanctions have made it almost impossible for Russia to secure loans on the international market.
So their savings are dwindling and nobody wants to lend them money. Not a good place to be when you're waging a very expensive war. Yeah. Not ideal. And it's really important to remember, these economic woes we're talking about, they're not just abstract figures on a balance sheet. They translate to very real consequences for the Russian people, just adding to those anxieties and hardships we were talking about earlier.
It's easy to imagine, right? Like how this is all trickling down and really impacting ordinary Russians.
Oh, absolutely. Visual politic is really, they're bringing that human cost to the forefront. But they also point out this other layer of vulnerability that I think is really important. It's not just about the sanctions themselves, but who Russia is having to rely on to get around them.
Right, like finding new trading partners, new
Hmm.
suppliers. Who's filling in that gap left by the West?
Well, that's the thing. It's not exactly a who's who of economic powerhouses. Visual politic highlights how Russia's become increasingly reliant on imports from countries like North Korea and Iran. Not exactly known for their, rock solid supply chains or cutting edge tech.
Wow, that is a huge shift. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that Russia was trying to present itself as this major player on the global stage, and now they're having to go to North Korea and Iran. That just seems like a desperate scramble.
That's the sense you get, and I think it really gets at the unsustainable nature of this whole Esparta strategy. Like, Visual Politic argues that this reliance on outdated technology, forced labor, these increasingly desperate trade deals, like trying to fill a well without a bottom.
A well without a bottom, that's a powerful image. It's like
Yeah.
no matter how much they pour into this war effort, it's just disappearing with nothing to show for it.
Exactly. It's the trap of this economy of war. It can create this facade of self-sufficiency and resilience, but underneath it's often built on a really shaky foundation. And this is where Visual Politic brings in, I think, a really interesting twist. They start talking about the potential for the West to actually leverage this economic vulnerability.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the pressure on Russia, but what about flipping it? What kind of economic leverage does the West still have at this point?
See, Visual Politic argues that the West has a trump card, and it's not necessarily about these massive military aid packages or even coming up with more crippling sanctions.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What is this trump card?
They say it's about strategic financial support to Ukraine. Like,
Yeah.
even relatively small targeted investments in key sectors of the Ukrainian economy could have a huge impact. We're not even talking about just the raw numbers here.
So it's not about how much money is being spent, but where it's going and how it's being used.
Exactly. It's like economic acupuncture, targeting those pressure points. It can really bolster Ukraine's ability to withstand this, and by extension, weaken Russia's position. They even draw this comparison to the Marshall Plan, that massive U.S. effort to rebuild Europe after World War II.
The Marshall Plan. That's an interesting comparison.
Yeah.
But wasn't that about rebuilding after the war was already over? How does that apply to what's happening right now in Ukraine?
That's a great point, and that's really at the heart of Visual Politics' argument. They're not talking about a carbon copy of the Marshall Plan, of course, but
Okay.
this idea of strategically deploying economic resources to bolster Ukraine's ability to withstand this while it's still happening.
So it's about empowering Ukraine to be economically self-sufficient in the long run, even as the war continues.
Exactly. And Visual Politic actually has this great term for it. They call it Plan Biden, which is obviously a deliberate echo of the Marshall Plan, but it's tailored to this conflict. And they argue that the real beauty of this approach is that it goes beyond just the purely economic.
So there's a psychological component to this as well.
Absolutely. It's about sending a message. By showing this kind of sustained commitment to Ukraine's economic future, the West is basically telling Putin, time is not on your side. They're calling his bluff.
Wow. So it really is like this high-stakes game of chicken, both sides pushing and pushing.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it comes down to who's going to blink first.
Exactly. And, while the West is debating its next move, Putin seems pretty determined to double down on this economy of war. But as Visual Politic highlights, that strategy has some pretty hefty hidden costs, and those are only mounting for the Russian people.
Yeah, it feels like we're talking about this really delicate balance, right? Like trying to weigh these huge geopolitical forces with the very real human impact this is having in both Russia and Ukraine.
Absolutely. And it's so easy to get caught up, in the day-to-day news cycle and lose sight of that bigger picture.
Totally. So for our listener today, if they're hearing all this, what's a key takeaway? What's the so what factor here? Why should they care about this whole economic side of the war?
Right. That's the question. And I think what Visual Politic really highlights here is that understanding the economic realities, it's crucial to understanding where this whole conflict might be headed. This isn't just about, tanks and troops on the ground. It's a war of attrition, a battle of wills, and the
And
economy is the battleground.
it's about who can outlast the other. Who can handle the economic pressure the longest, not just who has the most firepower at the very beginning, right?
Precisely. And we've seen how both sides are facing these immense economic challenges. Russia's economy of war, as Visualpolitik calls it, looks more and more precarious, but at the same time, the West's strategy of using economic leverage, that's a gamble too. It's not without its risks.
It's like every move has these ripple effects that go way beyond just the immediate situation.
Exactly. And those ripple effects, they always seem to hit everyday people the hardest.
Always.
Yeah.
And it really brings us back to that question that Visualpolitik leaves us with. What are the costs of intervening versus the risks of not doing anything?
It's a tough question to grapple with, for sure.
Yeah, no easy answers. But I think this has been really eye-opening. We don't always get to hear about this economic engine that's driving everything behind the scenes.
It's an engine that's definitely showing signs of strain on both sides, I think it's safe to say.
And on that note, I guess we'll have to leave it there for today. It's a lot to process for sure. But hopefully, our listeners now have a better grasp on the economic factors that are shaping this conflict, thanks to Visualpolitik's analysis.
It's definitely a complex issue with no simple solutions.
That's for sure. But hey, that's why we do these deep dives, right? To really dig into these complex issues.
Exactly. Got to keep asking those tough questions.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll let everyone get back to their day. But remember, keep digging deeper, keep learning, and we'll be back next time with another deep dive.